Boldwood presents The Weekender, written by Fay Keenan and read by Harriet Hare. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood.
Chapter 1. White sage is all very well, Holly Renton reflected, but the ashes are a bugger to get out of the carpet. Earlier that morning, before the shop had opened, Holly had carried out a ritual called smudging, which was meant to purify the energy in a building, promote positivity, and remove negative energies. Picking up the dustpan and brush, she emptied the pungent remains of the dried herb bundle she'd ignited and then wafted around the windows and doors of the shop into the bin. I know you recommend this all the time for other people's houses, but why are you so bloody obsessed with doing it in the shop? Rachel, Holly's sister, glanced down at where Holly was still brushing the rug under the mullioned front window of Common Sense, the shop, specialising in herbal remedies and well-being aids that Holly ran in the sleepy, but nonetheless new age, small town of Willowbury, and smiled. Just beyond the shop's counter, the door that led to Holly's small backyard was open, and Harry, Rachel's 3-year-old son and Holly's nephew, was playing happily with a set of wooden animal-shaped blocks in their own lorry, which had come from a box of assorted toys that Holly kept specifically for the younger customers. Holly didn't believe, unlike some of her business-owning neighbours, that children should be banned from places like hers. And, since the early spring weather was warm and pleasant, Harry had trundled out into the sunlight to play. "You've got to refresh places from time to time," Holly replied, "especially when there's been a lot of negative energy about, and since all the scandal with Hugo Fitzgerald. I really felt like this place needed a spiritual cleanse." "You can say that again." Rachel reached under the wooden apothecary's dresser that displayed countless jars of pots and dried herbs and flowers, all purporting to be of some spiritual or physical benefit, to retrieve one of the toy llamas that Harry had thrown under it. What a way to go. "Oh, I don't know," Holly replied, still sweeping. At least, having had a massive coronary, he wouldn't have known much about it. "But what a waste of a good plate of scones and jam," Rachel grinned. "Mum told me that his constituency agent found him face down in them at his desk." "I wouldn't have fancied digging him out of them," Holly said. "But from the size of him, the heart attack was an accident waiting to happen. And, gossip has it, he had his finger in a lot of pies, not just the odd plate of scones. Oh, you know how the rumour mill goes into overdrive when something like this happens." Rachel, who had more of a tendency to see the good in people than her sister did, dismissed Holly's comments with the wave of her hand. "I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't a prat, but nothing was ever proven about his financial misdemeanours. Although, I have to admit, since he couldn't have given a stuff about Harry's condition and getting access to these new drugs, I'm hoping the new guy will be more receptive to the cause. It's still bloody unfair that he gets to swan in here and take the seat after only the quietest by-election," Holly grumbled as she replaced the dustpan and brush on the shelf behind the counter. "I mean, the guy's only a year older than me, and he's been parachuted into one of the safest seats in the country. Even if we have a change of government, he's unlikely ever to lose his seat. What if he's just as crap as Fitzgerald and couldn't care less about us here in his constituency? We're stuck with him until he chooses to retire. Give him a chance," Rachel said reasonably. "We might be good for this place." "Have you made an appointment to see him yet?" Holly asked, glancing down to where Harry was now building a tower of exotic wooden animals that was getting more and more precarious the higher it got. From the outside, Harry looked like any other energetic 3-year-old, but on the inside, it was a different story. Weeks after he'd been born, Rachel had been launched into a perpetual, revolving carousel of physiotherapy, medications, and experimental trials in an attempt to alleviate the chronic condition cystic fibrosis that would, in all likelihood, limit Harry's life. The latest medication, which might make a huge difference to Harry's life expectancy, was currently being held up because the government was still negotiating with the pharmaceutical company involved over a reasonable price to supply it to the National Health Service. How it was possible to put a cost on a life such as Harry's was a source of increasing frustration and heartbreak for Rachel and the family. Not yet, Rachel sighed. If Hugo Fitzgerald couldn't be asked to do anything other than toe the party line, then why should this new guy be any better? Especially if he's a total rookie. I doubt he'll stick his neck out for Harry. Noticing Rachel was, unusually for her, close to tears, Holly hurried around from behind the counter and gave her sister a hug. "Don't let it get you down," she murmured. "I'll always be right there with you, campaigning to get this little munchkin the treatment he deserves." "I know," Rachel replied, giving Holly a shaky smile. "I'm fine, really. It's just when he has a bad day. It reminds me of the challenges he's facing, which will only get worse as he gets older, and knowing that the new medications could potentially make those challenges so much easier to face." "We'll get there," Holly said. "I'll be with you every step of the way, like I always have been. And I still think it's worth a punt with this new guy. You never know." "I'll try and get in to see him over the summer," Rachel replied, breaking the embrace from her sister and grabbing the last of the wooden animals to add to Harry's tower of jungle wildlife. "Can I make a drink?" "Of course," Holly said. "I've got some organic fair trade matcha tea in the kitchen." "Is that the super energising stuff?" Rachel said. "After being up with Harry last night, I could certainly do with a lift." "Honestly, it'll keep you going until midnight," Holly said. "Go on. You know you want to." "All right," Rachel replied, "but if I end up buzzing around Willowbury like a wasp for the rest of the day, I'm blaming you." "Fair enough. And make me a cup too," Holly called as Rachel disappeared up the stairs to Holly's flat above the shop. Popping the dustpan and brush behind the counter again, she continued the conversation, since Rachel had left the door to the flat open. "Perhaps I should give this new guy the benefit of the doubt," she said, adjusting the labels on the jars of dried herbs and plants on the dresser so they all pointed uniformly outwards. After all, new blood could be a good thing. "Perhaps we should be fair and reserve judgment until he's been in the job a few months," Rachel said over the bubble of the kettle. "You never know. He could be just the tonic this place needs politically." "You always try and look on the bright side, don't you?" Holly was preoccupied for a moment with the Bluetooth speaker that usually piped relaxing, locally composed and produced music through the shop during business hours. The thing was a touch temperamental, but she just managed to reconnect it to her phone. Scrolling through her Spotify playlists, she thought she'd better try it out with something a little more lively. So she selected one of her current favourite film soundtracks, an all-singing, all-dancing number that was sure to blast out any gremlins from the Bluetooth connection. As the singer's voice boomed through the shop, Rachel's response to her somewhat rhetorical question was lost in the pleasant din of the soundtrack. Determined to stop talking about a subject that was clearly getting more under her skin than she'd anticipated, Holly raised her voice above the music. Calling up the stairs to her sister and, unable to help herself, lifting her arms to sway to the beat of the song. "Well, he'll have to do a whole lot more for this constituency than fingers in the till Fitzgerald did to get my vote. And, to be honest, I don't really hold out much hope for some career politician who's just been parachuted in. Do you?" Holly, caught in the rhythm of the song, completely failed to notice the appearance of a figure at her open shop door, who paused, motionless, unsure now of what his approach should be. To be fair, though, even if she had been aware, she probably wouldn't have been too concerned. Holly wasn't one to worry too much about what people thought. Having lived the life she had and owning the business that she did, public opinion was the least of her worries. What she didn't realise, though, was that the encounter with this particular customer would change her life forever. Chapter 2. The voice, clear as a bell, cut over the top of the cheesy tunes of The Greatest Showman as Charlie Thorpe walked in through the open door of Common Sense. Although somewhat stung by the stridency in the speaker's voice, he reflected, perhaps he shouldn't have been surprised. Surveying the shop floor, he'd been assailed by hanging crystals, his nostrils filled with the scent of burning herbs, his eyes assaulted by the myriad rainbow-coloured new-aged books on the shelves, and his mind overwhelmed by the shelves of apothecary jars of weird-looking dried plants, all labelled, he admitted grudgingly, with exquisitely handwritten names. He wondered how many of them were strictly legal, despite what the label said. Miss Renton? He asked, closing the shop door behind him, which elicited an alarming jangle from the bells tied to the top of it. The dancing figure froze with her arms above her head. Slim arms, Charlie noticed, with the hint of a tattoo peeking out from one shoulder, revealed by her vest top. Charlie felt even more like an intruder on some strange planet. He'd known Willowbury was the home of all things alternative when he'd applied to stand as the replacement Member of Parliament. But the last time he'd been in this shop, admittedly some years before, and long before he'd considered becoming an MP, this place had been a toy shop. He'd bought a cuddly toy dog for his newborn nephew, which the baby had promptly vomited on. The only touch of normality, to his eyes, was the sight of an adorable, curly-haired toddler sitting on the floor by the open back door, playing with a selection of exotic wooden animals. As the dancer turned around, Charlie noticed her clear blue eyes, the pale skin, and the long, messily tied back auburn hair. Tendrils escaping to soften the high cheekbones and the slightly pointed nose. A large, generous mouth, probably captivating when it smiled fully, was curled up slightly at the edges as she looked him briefly up and down. "It's Holly," the woman replied, seemingly not embarrassed in the slightest by the fact she'd been sprung swaying to some highly suspect soundtrack during business hours. Not to mention slagging off the local MP to his face. Well, almost. Not that she knew that, of course. "And you are—" She glanced down at her phone and slid the volume control down a notch or three to a more sociable level before putting it back on the shop counter. "Charlie Thorpe." He extended a hand and tried not to look too closely at the one she offered in return, which appeared to have traces of nicotine staining on the fingertips. "I'm just doing a quick tour of the local, businesses to introduce myself." "Why? Are you the new manager of the pub?" Holly asked, having clocked his looking but not looking glance at her fingertips and the way he dropped his hand immediately after he'd shaken hers. She was surprised he didn't wipe his hand on his jeans. He seemed so put off. She thought about explaining that she'd been hand-dyeing some fabric out the back in a strong turmeric solution, but didn't bother. He probably wouldn't have got it anyway. From the looks of his clothes, he was more of a designer guy. The crisp white shirt, open at the neck, and the dark blue, slim but not skinny jeans, with a tan belt looked suspiciously expensive, as did the boots he was wearing. Somehow, she doubted that they were vegan leather. "Not exactly." Charlie smiled, what he hoped was a winning smile. "I'm the new Member of Parliament for the area." Charlie felt a stab of satisfaction as Holly's cheeks flushed slightly, clashing with her hair. Clearly, she hadn't expected to be overheard in her vocal criticisms of him and his new job. "So, you're the one taking over from Fingers in the Till Fitzgerald, are you? Good luck with that." "Thanks," Charlie said gruffly. He wondered if he should leap to the defence of his predecessor, but conceded that actually Holly was probably right about the fiddling, and not just with the cash, but also with interns, if local gossip was to be believed. So he decided not to. It's going to take me a while to get my bearings, so I wanted to come and say hello while Parliament's in recess for the Easter holidays. Since I'm new to the area, I want to make the most of the time to settle in. Among his plans was a visit to every local business in his constituency, which included several cider farms, as well as quite a few smaller concerns like Holly's shop. While he was looking forward to sampling some of the produce at the cider farm, if he got the chance, he wasn't entirely sure if anything from common sense really took his fancy. "Oh, I see," said Holly. "Doing the rounds, checking out your patch then." "So, how long have you had the shop?" Charlie asked, ignoring the veiled jibe. "Press the flesh, Charlie. Form a rapport with everyone you can. You never know when you might need their support." "About 4 years," Holly replied. "I was left some money by my grandfather, and, after wondering what on earth to do with it, other than blowing it on fast cars and drugs, I decided to invest in this place." She grinned. "I'm joking about the drugs, by the way." Charlie found himself smiling back and trying not to glance again at the weird, dried herbs and plants that had caught his attention as he'd walked in. "I'm glad to hear it." He glanced around the shop. "So, what are your, best-selling items?" "Oh, you know," Holly replied. "Everyone who moves house wants a stash of white sage to burn to chase away the bad vibes, and I get a lot of tourists in who love the fact that we're in the shadow of Willowbury Hill here, which, I'm sure you know, is a hugely important spiritual and archaeological site." She pulled an odd-looking doll off the shelf behind her. "And people fed up with their jobs tend to like these." She pressed it into his hands. Charlie looked alarmed, until he took a closer look and found it was a jokey representation of a voodoo doll, split into sections marked with things like "talked over me at the meeting," "stole my ideas," and "denied me a pay rise." He laughed gamely. "I can see why they're popular. Perhaps I'll buy a few to take back to the house." "Have this one on the house," Holly said. "Or would that constitute a bribe?" "I think I can put it on the declaration of members' interests," Charlie said. There was a barely perceptible pause between them. Charlie cleared his throat. "Well, thank you for this." He tucked the doll into his pocket. "And it was nice to meet you. As a local business owner, I hope we'll be able to discuss your concerns in more detail." "Oh, you can save me the political spiel." Holly's eyes sparkled. "I'm afraid you shouldn't count on my vote. I'm rather more in the Green Party camp these days." Charlie grinned at her, oddly charmed by her forthrightness. "Then I hope between now and the next general election, I might be able to change your mind." Holly smiled back. "Been there, done that, did some student conferences." She countered. "I found I wasn't too keen on the company after a while." Charlie felt a sudden rush of recognition at her words. Now that she'd dropped her guard and he'd spent a little time talking to her, he couldn't help thinking that she looked like someone he'd known a long time ago. For one night only. But it couldn't be her. The girl he knew had been sensibly dressed in an on-the-knee neutral suit. Party colours and party line, he thought wryly. 19 years old, with subtle lipstick and strawberry blonde hair cut in a sensible bob. But then, he supposed, it was a decade and a half ago. Anything more adventurous would have been unexpected, especially in that context. He was sure, looking back on it, that his sartorial choices would have been just as suspect. "Can't say I blame you," Charlie replied gamely, trying to shrug off the sense of déjà vu that Holly had suddenly evoked. "I intend to spend as much time in the constituency as I can. Westminster can be a bit of a bubble, if you know what I mean." "I suppose that's what you all say when you get appointed," Holly said, with a slight edge to her voice. I bet even Hugo Fitzgerald was an idealist 25 years ago. Shame he never really got anything done around here. We're not all lazy fat cats, you know, Charlie replied, a little more sharply than he'd intended. Some of us go into politics for the right reasons. I'm sure, Holly replied, but you'll forgive me if I say time will tell on that. I hope I'll be able to show you, Charlie said. There was a pause, which he took as his cue to leave. Take care, Holly. You too, Holly said brightly, gesturing to the door. I'll look forward to you proving me otherwise. Charlie, feeling more unsettled with the encounter than he had so far with any of the other shop owners, walked to the door. He suspected that he'd have a long way to go to demonstrate his worth as an MP to Holly. Strangely, however, he found himself wanting to do so, if only to prove her wrong. Chapter 3. Who was that? Rachel came carefully downstairs from Holly's flat to the shop floor carrying 2 mugs and a teapot on a wooden tray. Looked fit from behind, whoever he was. Holly shook her head. You should get out more. Taking the mug from the tray, once Rachel had poured some tea into it, she sipped the strong, re-energising tea. So, who was it? Holly felt her cheeks warm a little as she recalled the slightly awkward encounter. That was Charlie Thorpe, the new MP for Willowbury and Stavenham. Wow, really? I hope he didn't hear you slacking him off. Rachel grinned. I mean, that would have been awkward. She paused, catching sight of her sister's expression. He heard you, didn't he? Holly grinned. From the way he couldn't wait to get out of here, I assume he did. She took another gulp of tea. I don't care. He needs to know that some of us aren't just going to give him the easy ride that Hugo Fitzgerald had. He's going to have to work to represent us. Oh, hard cue, Rachel teased. Sounds like he's bringing out your militant side already. Not that it needs any encouragement, of course. Holly had taken part in several high-profile Green Party demonstrations over the years and was known as a bit of a rabble-rouser, as well as a keen supporter of local green initiatives. She'd organised several litter picks and recycling runs in the town since taking on the shop, and was known to wince every time she saw a discarded plastic bag or bottle blowing in the breeze. An ethical eater, her love of a good bacon sandwich meant she couldn't quite become fully vegetarian, but she tried to source her food as locally and organically as possible. Outside, in the small courtyard behind the shop, she had a raised bed that was packed full of aromatics and herbs, which she cooked fresh, when she could, and dried and stored in jars for the winter months. I just don't like seeing someone getting something for nothing, Holly muttered. What? You mean like we did? Rachel reminded Holly gently. They'd been the joint beneficiaries of their paternal grandfather's will. The money had been in trust until they both reached adulthood. While their father had initially raised an eyebrow about Holly's business venture, he couldn't dispute the fact that the shop made money, however improbably, and he was justifiably proud of the path she'd taken. Rachel, the more conventional sister, had put most of hers into buying a home for herself and Harry after her divorce. That was different, Holly said. Grandfather made a weird decision, but one we've really tried to make the best of. After all, I don't think you'll find Mum and Dad complaining that we're not running to them every 5 seconds for money. Absolutely, Rachel agreed. Although for all my looking on the bright side, as you call it, there's not enough money in the world to get Harry new lungs, or in the trust to fund the drugs he needs privately. She shook her head. We'll get there, Holly said softly, looking over at where Harry was now playing. The government and the drug companies will see sense eventually. The way the issue keeps being highlighted by campaigners and the media, you have to keep believing it, sis. I know. Rachel drank the rest of her tea. I've got to go. Harry's got a check-up at the hospital. We're going to make an afternoon of it and grab an early dinner in Bristol if it all runs to time." Gesturing to Harry, she took the toddler's hand and, after kissing her sister goodbye, she headed out of the door of the shop. Holly's heart ached as they left. She wished there was something else she could do. But even if she sold the shop and the two sisters pooled their resources, it still wouldn't be enough. Since Rachel got divorced a couple of years ago, the main responsibility for caring for Harry had become hers alone, with her ex-husband having moved to Singapore for his career. Rachel and Harry were financially provided for well enough by him, but that wasn't the same as having someone to share the ups and downs of having a child with a serious illness day to day. Thus, the two sisters had grown closer, to the extent that they saw each other most days now they both lived in Willowbury. Reluctantly, Holly's thoughts wandered back to the visitor she'd just had. Perhaps Charlie Thorpe would be able to help after all. Then again, after he'd heard her opinion about him jumping into his dead colleague's seat, she wondered if he'd be willing to listen to her anyway. Sighing, she changed the background music and settled in for an afternoon of retail. She'd recently taken a massage course, which she was considering offering to customers, but she hadn't yet been brave enough to advertise it in the shop. Perhaps it was time to take the plunge. Taking a deep breath, she logged into Common Sense's website and created a new page titled Holistic Massage Therapy and filled out a few details. Printing out a copy to put in the window of the shop, she wondered if anyone in Willowbury would let her loose on their back, shoulders, or even feet. She could think of a few people who she wouldn't want to touch with a barge pole, and it would be just her luck to be lumbered with some of Willowbury's less savoury residents as clients. But who knew? Perhaps some would give it a go. As she was finishing the page, she couldn't help wondering what Charlie Thorpe would look like with his shirt off on her massage table, but quickly squashed that idea. After the way he'd reacted to her and her shop, she couldn't imagine him crossing the threshold anytime soon. Chapter 4. Charlie had been under no illusions that he was going to have a tricky time when he took on the Willowbury and Stavenham parliamentary seat. It wasn't just that Hugo Fitzgerald had been cordially loathed by his constituents, although enough of them had kept voting him in, year after year, to give him a very comfortable majority. But also, in comparison, he'd been seen initially as nothing more than a wet-behind-the-ears career politician. He was resigned to the fact that it would take at least 5 years to gain their trust. A Westminster parliamentary term, in fact, and probably 20 before he was regarded as a local in this most Somerset of Somerset villages. Yet again, he wondered why he'd said yes. He was a Yorkshireman by birth, and felt like a fish out of water down in the West Country. Even though he'd often visited when he'd had a girlfriend who lived in the area, the Mendip Hills were no substitute for the Yorkshire moors. He felt too smooth, too green, not angular enough for his tastes. Exiting Holly Renton's ridiculously named shop, still smarting from her casual dismissal of his effectiveness, or lack thereof, he wandered back up Willowbury High Street, noticing properly, for the first time, just what kind of stock in trade this place had. When he'd been offered the seat after Hugo's death, he'd imagined Willowbury to be a kind of tea shops and gourmet ploughman's lunches patch, wealthy, middle class, and church-going constituents whose main concerns were where the new motorway junction was going to be built, and whose view was going to be ruined by the next new housing development. While Willowbury wasn't exactly inner-city Leeds, where he'd cut his teeth campaigning as a candidate, in a seat that hadn't been held by his party in nearly 40 years, it wasn't what he'd been expecting either. For a start, the preponderance of what might be called New Age establishments, although he'd been warned that this was not a marker that the traders themselves much care for, was rather more akin to Totnes, the place in Devon where he'd spent his holidays as a child. There was no getting away from it, he thought as he wandered back up the rather steep high street. Everywhere you looked in Willowbury was a crystal, a mural, or a shop selling spiritual how-to guides. And this was one of the major towns in his constituency. While not himself a religious man, Charlie had grown up as a kind of fair-weather Christian. Church on Christmases and Easter days, a carol service every year, and a remembrance parade as a scout. This kind of earth-based alternative spirituality took some getting used to. And get used to it he must, he supposed. He looked down at the toy voodoo doll Holly had given him and grimaced. "Morning, my lord." A broad, rather mocking voice, rich with the vowels of the county, broke into his thoughts. "And how are you on this fine day?" Charlie's head snapped up, and he came face to face with Miles Fairbrother, who considered himself a local wit as well as the owner of the town's bakery. "Charlie'll do fine," Charlie replied, smiling gamely at the master baker. "I'm not in the House of Lords just yet. Only a matter of time, I'm sure," Miles winked. "So, how's business, Miles?" Charlie asked, keen to practice his small talk. Press the flesh, Charlie, no matter how unattractive or annoying it is. Not bad, Miles said. "Course, I'm not selling quite as many scones as I used to, given what happened to your predecessor, but at least the gluten-free bread's starting to shift. That's a fad that seems to be sticking." "Glad to hear it," Charlie replied. "I must pop in and try some when I'm a bit more settled in." He was slightly surprised at how easily the platitudes could come when talking to someone like Miles. Privately, he thought that he'd rather get gluten-free bread from anyone other than Miles, even if he was a local businessman. "On the house for the local MP," Miles said. "At least your first will be. Never know when I might need a favour." Charlie suppressed a grimace. He had no idea what Hugo's dealings with the baker had been, but instinctively, he knew he probably shouldn't go too far to find out. "That's very kind of you, Miles, but I'd like to support the businesses in my constituency." Miles held up a hand. "I'm joking, of course, me personally. I'm glad you've taken over it, but there are some round here it'll be harder to please." "I think I've already encountered one of them," Charlie said, glancing unthinkingly back towards common sense. "Oh, don't worry about her," Miles said. "She and her sister are always on their high horse about something. Doesn't know how good she's got it, living here, with that shop smack in the middle of the high street." Charlie, kicking himself mentally for speaking carelessly to Miles, of all people, smiled. "Oh, it was nothing like that, honestly. Anyway, I'd best get on. It was nice to see you, Miles." "Nice to see you too, my lord." Miles winked and strode back off to the bakery, which is at the bottom of the high street. The Fairbrothers had been the town bakers for 5 generations, and Charlie already knew that Miles held sway on the town council and the Chamber of Commerce. He was also a significant donor to Charlie's local party funds. Much as he'd instinctively disliked the man, he was one that he definitely had to keep on side if he was going to get anywhere politically. Looking at his watch, Charlie cursed as he realised he was going to be late for the first of several appointments at his constituency office. He was due to start at 12, and he'd not read through the briefing notes his ever-efficient agent had emailed him the night before. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his appointments list and, with a stab of dismay, concluded he was going to be holed up in the office until well after 6 o'clock that evening. The life of a rural MP, he thought, was not exactly a sleepy one. Resolving to grab a quick takeaway coffee from the Costa machine at the newsagent's, he hurried towards his office. As he let himself back in through the door, he couldn't help reflecting once again on his meeting with Holly Renton in her shop. Something was niggling at him. Something about her he just couldn't place. He couldn't help thinking he'd met her somewhere before. Chapter 5. Holly closed the shop after a relatively successful day's trading and headed up the stairs to the flat she lived in above the shop. Having bought the freehold of the building with her inheritance, she had taken time to make both the shop and her home exactly as she wanted them to be. And she even had the benefit of a small, enclosed garden at the back of the property, where she would sit out sometimes and, in good weather, lead the odd meditation or yoga session. A haven of peace and serenity, the garden was footed by a large, ancient horse-chestnut tree, which Holly occasionally called in the local tree surgeon to prune, and under whose boughs she could conduct her meditations and sit and read in the warmer months. Tonight, though, she needed to get inside and feed the mewing ball of ginger fur that was weaving in and out of her ankles on the way up the stairs. "Arthur," she chided, as the cat skittered in front of her, "if I break my neck on these steps, you'll only have me to eat, and I'm not sure you'll enjoy that." Arthur turned at the sound of her voice, gave her a withering look, and then bounded ahead to the kitchen, to where his bowls resided in the corner. Giving a hungry yowl, he sprung up on his hind legs and dug his claws playfully into the back of Holly's knees as she pulled down the cat food from the cupboard. "Is it any wonder I can't wear short skirts, with you lacerating my legs at every opportunity?" Holly reached down and gave the cat a playful tap on the nose. She filled his bowl with food, and then, mission accomplished, Arthur turned his back and began to devour his dinner. Turning her mind to her encounter with Charlie Thorpe as she prepared her own food, Holly was irritated to feel another blush creeping up her cheeks. It hadn't exactly been her finest hour, she conceded, although she'd never been one to hide her true feelings. Her father always said that she and Rachel would have made the perfect child if combined. Rachel was diplomatic and perhaps a little too self-effacing, whereas Holly spoke her mind at every available opportunity, and had done since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. Her mouth had got her into hot water more than once in her youth, and while she'd learned to think before she spoke most of the time these days, she was still prone to being more honest than was good for her when she was rattled or irritated. And Charlie Thorpe had rattled her before she even met him. Perhaps it had been a little unfair to write him off before he'd had the chance to settle into Willowbury, but she trusted her gut, and her gut was telling her that having a new MP wouldn't make a scrap of difference to her, or, more importantly, to Harry. But what if she was wrong? What if Charlie was being sincere in his desire to make a positive difference in Willowbury? And was it possible that Holly was just being distracted by the fact that he was rather good-looking, in that classic, tall, dark and handsome kind of way? "Stop it," Holly said. Arthur looked up from his bowl, where he was making short work of his whiskers. "Not you, gorgeous," Holly added hastily. The cat gave her another look and got back to his food. Holly sighed as she grabbed the jar of linguine from the back of her kitchen counter and slapped some into her pasta pan. There was no point in continuing to think about Charlie Thorpe. She'd probably never cross paths with him again. After all, she couldn't remember Hugo Fitzgerald ever bothering to visit her shop when he'd been alive, and he'd been the MP for over 20 years. Why should Charlie be any different? Willowbury in Stavenham was a cushy number, and all he really had to do was show his face a bit and kiss a few babies, and he'd be guaranteed the seat until he retired. A few minutes later, having sautéed the contents of her vegetable drawer and thrown in a few herbs she'd gathered fresh from the raised bed in her garden, Holly grated some of the Cheddar Gorge Cheese Company's finest matured cheddar over her dinner and settled down on the balcony overlooking her garden, where she'd placed a small bistro table and 2 chairs, one for her, she'd joked to Rachel when she'd bought it, and one for Arthur. Now she was over 30, she wondered how much of a joke that actually was these days. Was she doomed to grow older and more eccentric, until she became the tie-dyed, caftan-wearing, wild-haired stereotype of a Willowbury alternative health business owner? Just her and Arthur, forevermore. As if he could read her thoughts, having demolished his own food, Arthur came padding out to the balcony and sprang up onto the other bistro chair, settling down on the cushion to take in the early evening sun's rays. While not a compulsive phone checker, Holly had her mobile at the side of her dinner plate to hear from Rachel about Harry's afternoon checkup. On cue, her phone pinged. Heart thumping, Holly swiped the screen, hoping that the news from the hospital would be good. Harry seemed to be having a settled few months and was remarkably stoical about the huge amount of medications he had to take every day. But she still breathed a sigh of relief when she read Rachel's update. Harry's lung function had been as expected, and his meds hadn't been increased, so that was a definite win. Texting back a quick reply, Holly relaxed into her chair and finished her dinner. If nothing else, Harry's condition had taught her to take each day and count each blessing as they came. Who knew what tomorrow, or the next day, might bring? While she had her phone open, Holly decided to check to see if anyone had signed up for a massage, now that their online booking had gone live on Common Sense's website. Since she'd have to offer the massages after Common Sense had closed for business, given that most of the time she was on her own at work, she didn't intend to take more than 1 or 2 bookings a week. Tapping through to the admin pages on her site, she smiled to see that there had been a fair bit of interest. But, just as quickly, her heart sank when she saw the name of the person who'd made the first booking. Of all the people she wouldn't have wanted to get her hands on, she had to be the worst. Oh well, Holly thought. At least I'll have the chance to practice on her, and she'll certainly tell me if I'm no good. Swiping the screen to confirm the booking for tomorrow and send an automatic confirmation email, Holly stood up again and took her plate back through to the kitchen. She'd better spend the evening mugging up on some of the techniques she'd learnt on her massage course to make sure she did the best job she could on her first paying client. What a shame, though, that it had to be Rachel's irritating next-door neighbour, Harriet Meadows. With more bark than a Jack Russell, the woman barely kept quiet long enough to relax and enjoy anything, let alone a massage. If nothing else, having her on the table might help Rachel's stress levels a little, since Harriet had a tendency to complain about everything, from the height of the fence in Rachel's back garden to the sound of Harry playing out with his little friends in the summer. Holly grinned to herself as she put her mind to the kind of massage that would best suit Harriet the Harridan, and found she was quite looking forward to trying out some of her firmer techniques. Chapter 6. At around 11 o'clock the next day, Charlie decided he'd had enough of unpacking, both in his new home, which was a charming townhouse a stone's throw from the high street, and in his new office, which he'd virtually had to gut to make it more to his tastes. When he'd walked into the door of what had been Hugo Fitzgerald's erstwhile office, he'd imagined for one terrible moment that he'd be confronted with the corpse of the MP, still face down in the scones. Cursing himself for his childishness, he'd been only slightly less horrified when he'd realised the MP and his constituency agent, who'd retired when his boss had died, hadn't exactly been experts at filing. He'd spent the next 8 hours sorting out the box files and papers on subjects as diverse as the much-disputed Willowbury bypass, 35 years at least in the discussion, and a complaint from a resident on the high street that one of the shop owners was sunbathing nude on the flat roof of their establishment during their lunch hour. Given Willowbury's long tradition of embracing all things alternative in terms of lifestyle, religion, spirituality and music, Charlie wasn't as surprised by this complaint as he could have been. When 9/10 of the paperwork had gone the way of his brand new office shredder, and he'd relocated the rest into relabelled box files, he decided it was time for a break before his constituency agent came in for a meeting. Assured by the chairman of his local branch of the party when he'd gained the seat that Tom Fielding would be an excellent candidate to fill the role of party liaison and constituency agent, especially for a rookie MP. Charlie hoped that Tom would be able to brief him on what the really important issues were in Willowbury and Stavenham. He'd met Tom briefly after he'd moved in, and had already established a good working relationship with the man who, being in his late 50s, was the kind of authority figure it was useful to have on your team. Charlie could have made a coffee from the jar of instant he'd found stashed away in the kitchen area of the office, but when he'd opened the lid, a moth had flown out, so he decided to get some fresh air before his morning meeting with Tom and head over to one of the cafes on the high street he'd spotted when he'd dropped in on Common Sense. Locking the door, he pocketed the key and headed up the road. As he wandered back along the row of the weird, wonderful and decidedly wacky shops that lined Willowbury High Street, the variety made him smile, as it did every time he walked this way. There was a bookshop called Vale Volumes, most of whose titles in the window seemed to focus on either spiritual healing or the search for King Arthur. A musical instrument shop, which, from the looks of it, didn't stock anything that was instantly recognisable to Charlie as anything that might be found in an orchestra. A shop front full of crystals of various sizes, all glinting in the sunshine, and an artisan handmade candle shop with wax creations of all kinds. Added to that was a brightly painted shop front emblazoned with fey floristry and bedecked with all kinds of blooms, local and more exotic. Charlie's back stiffened as he found his footsteps drawing closer to Common Sense Health and Wellbeing, where he'd encountered Holly Renton yesterday. A prickle of embarrassment and irritation prodded at the back of his neck as he recalled her casual dismissal of him, both before she'd been aware of his presence in the shop and, even if she had blushed a bit, after. He wasn't sure what was worse, really, indifference to politics or firm opinions, forcefully held. He was sure he'd come across plenty of both of them in this new job. Drawing level with the door of Common Sense, he found himself pausing to look at the window display. A mixture of tall altar candles, sparkling crystals of all colours, and hues that caught the light, and the odd sprig of dried herbs. It looked exotic and inviting. And Charlie had to admit that Holly had an eye for the enticing. If he had the slightest clue what any of the items in her shop window actually did, he was sure he'd be sold on them. As it was, he couldn't imagine having use for any of them in his life, even if the comedy voodoo doll was funny. Suddenly aware he might be seen to be loitering, and definitely not wanting to be caught, Charlie quickened his pace again. But not before he caught sight of Holly again with her back to the window. Hair in the same unruly updo that was escaping in tendrils down her shoulder blades, almost to her waist, atop a ladder and pulling down one of the large apothecary jars that resided behind the counter in a tall dresser. She had the kind of hair he longed to touch, and he was astonished to feel that prickle of irritation he'd felt turning to something else altogether as he allowed himself another moment to watch her. There was something so familiar about the curve of her shoulders, the gentle sweep of that long back into her waist. Why did he feel as though he'd encountered her before? Shaking his head, he tore his eyes back to the high street, in search of the coffee shop he knew was up the top of the town somewhere. Picking up his pace, he was tickled to find, on entering Willowbury's #1 coffee establishment, as dictated by the sign at the window at least, that even the hot beverages in this place had a twist of the alternative about them. Among the Americanos, lattes, flat whites that could be found anywhere was a smattering of exotic twists from all around the world, from Turkish to Egyptian to Vietnamese blends and varieties. Charlie wondered wryly whether air miles were factored into the cost. "Morning, sir!" A cheery voice greeted him as he walked up to the counter. The owner of The Voice, a man who Charlie judged to be in his late 30s, and from his name badge was called Jack, gestured to the menu behind him. "What can I get you?" Charlie glanced up to the menu boards and then back at the barista. "Just a flat white, thanks." "We've got a promotion on the fair trade Southwest Guatemalan beans this week, if you'd like to give them a go," Jack responded, a hint of chocolate and almond. Goes down beautifully with one of our amaretto croissants if you'd like one. Sounds great, thank you, Charlie replied. 5 minutes later, he was chowing down on a flaky, amaretto-soaked croissant and trying to identify the alleged flavour notes in the coffee. He'd taken a seat by the window so he could gaze out at the high street, which was showing more signs of life now than when he'd headed to his office earlier that morning. Even on a workaday Tuesday, he was surprised to see the more unusual inhabitants of Willowbury out in force. He was jolted to see a woman in nun's robes, standing by a cool box of what appeared to be wrapped sandwiches, which had a sign propped against it reading, "Free lunch for the homeless." There were 1 or 2 people taking advantage of this gentle charity and being handed a sandwich and a bottle of water with a calm and gentle smile by the nun. He had no idea that Willowbury had an issue with the homeless, although he figured, perhaps with its proximity to both the Strawberry Line cycle track and the more major towns of Wells and Taunton, both tourist traps, it became more of a magnet during the summer months. He made a note on his phone to add that to his list of inquiries for Tom Fielding when they met later on. Some members of his party were positively medieval when it came to their attitudes to the homeless. Charlie wasn't one of them. He believed in supporting people until they no longer needed to be supported. And if homelessness was an issue here, he needed to know about it. "How are you settling in?" The barista's voice broke into Charlie's thoughts, bringing him back into the moment. Jack was wiping a recently vacated table near to where Charlie was sitting in the window, and Charlie turned his head slightly to reply. "Well, thank you. I'm sorry I haven't popped in more officially yet. I've been up to my ears in paperwork." "I could imagine," Jack grinned. "Your predecessor didn't strike me as the most organised of folks. Spent more time in the bars in Westminster than in the chamber, by all accounts." "I couldn't possibly comment," Charlie said wryly, although his filing did leave a lot to be desired. "Happen to come across any paperwork concerning that proposed new motorway junction?" Jack asked, ultra casually, as he continued to clear up the table. Rumour has it that Hugo Fitzgerald took rather a large cut of the profits from the farmer who sold the land it's being built on in return for pushing it through under the new, more relaxed planning laws. Jack shook his head. "Although it's on hold now, of course." Ignoring Jack's obvious fishing for grubby specifics, Charlie raised an eyebrow. "On hold?" "Yep." Jack's eyes twinkled. Apparently, when the archaeological dig was scheduled, it turned up artefacts of specific historical interest to the town. Until the site can be fully excavated, there won't be a new junction going through there. Charlie raised his eyes skyward. He was rapidly finding out that Willowbury was full of oddities, some good and some rather less so. "That seems quite a coincidence," he said. "Well, you know how it is," Jack said, flinging his damp towel over his shoulders. "It's amazing what turns up when you least expect it. I mean, who knew there was an old Roman encampment right where the proposed junction was going to go? Not to mention possible proof that King Arthur really might have existed." His eyes twinkled again. "King Arthur as well?" Charlie smiled into his coffee. This place is full of surprises. Finishing up his croissant and his coffee, he glanced at his watch and realised that Tom would be waiting at the office in a few minutes. "Thanks for that," he said, as he took his plate and mug back to the counter. "No problem. See you again soon," Jack replied. "This place is a hub for local gossip, so if you need the lowdown of any of the local rumblings, feel free to ask. I'm the soul of indiscretion, as is my Twitter feed." Charlie laughed. "I'll bear that in mind." Strolling out of the coffee shop, he shook his head. Small-town living was going to take some getting used to, he thought, especially in a town as out there as Willowbury. But something told him he was going to like it. Chapter 7. That same afternoon, Holly was taking a lunch break, whilst Rachel kept an eye on the shop for half an hour, when their mother came through the back door of the flat with something large and bulky in her hands. As she waved off Holly's offer to help, she headed into the living room and placed the object, which was a little dusty, on Holly's coffee table in front of the sofa. "Your dad and I were having a bit of a clear-out of the eaves cupboard, and we thought you might like to have this." She gestured to the coffee table. "We took a quick look inside, and it seemed to be most of your university stuff." Holly laughed as she flipped the catches on the old-fashioned blue suitcase. "I hope you didn't find anything too incriminating in there." The suitcase smelt a little musty, from well over a decade in her parents' attic cupboard. But as she turned it over and flipped the rusting silver catches, opening the lid, she gasped. There, inside the case, was the contents of her university bedroom, complete with essays, posters, and even the old college handbook from her first year. "Bloody hell," Holly said. "I had no idea you'd kept this stuff." Pulling out a blue cardboard document wallet, she scanned through one of her English literature essays and shuddered. "I can't believe I ever got a degree with work like this." Holly had graduated with a more than respectable upper second-class honours degree in English and politics from the University of York. And as she rifled through the papers and pictures that were still neatly packed into folders and envelopes after 13 years in her parents' attic, she was assailed by memories of people, places and experiences she'd not thought about in years. Alongside the posters of classic films, Star Wars, Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, and Blade Runner, was a copy of the college handbook, a programme from a play she'd acted in during her first year, and a stack of photocopied journal articles on the Romantic poets. As she opened a large manila envelope, an equally large stack of photographs was revealed. Some of the snaps took her back instantly. The photograph of her dearest friends from university, taken after they'd laughed themselves weak watching an episode of Desperate Housewives, late one night while drinking sangria, mixed in a storage box from the works, reawakened a lot of good memories. Pictures of a couple of boyfriends from uni evoked some slightly different feelings. Nights out, nights in, famous sights, all were captured on disposable cameras and sent to actual film processing places to develop. Somehow, that seemed to make the memories more precious, despite the poor quality of the images. While Facebook meant that she'd reconnected with quite a lot of her university friends, it was still nice to see pictures of them all as they once were. One particular shot that made her smile was their recreation of an iconic scene from Friends, with each of them looking round the doorframe of one of their hall's bedrooms. Reaching for another pile of photographs, she furrowed her brow, trying to remember where they were taken. They were mostly of London landmarks, and many were blurry and out of focus. She couldn't remember ever going to London when she was at university, as it was quite a trek from York, and for a moment she was confused. Were these her photographs? Or had she picked up someone else's when she'd cleared out her room for the last time? Goodness knows things were very hectic at the end of that last summer term, and she and her friends were always leaving stuff in each other's rooms. But as she flipped through them, she was brought up short by a very familiar face, and her heart started to flutter as the spreading brushstrokes of recognition filtered across the blank page of her memory. Something she'd forgotten about. Someone she'd forgotten about.